After 1 e4, e5, 2 knight f3, knight c6, 3 bishop b5, a6, which is the better retreat? 4 bishop c4 or 4 bishop a4? Incorrect. None of the professional players I know of play 4 bishop b5 c4 here. Either they take the black knight, 4 bishop b5 takes c6, or they withdraw the bishop to queen rook 4, 4 bishop b5 a4, both of which are typical responses in the Ruy-Lopez. 1 e2 e4, e7 e5, 2 knight g1 f3, knight b8 c6, 3 bishop f1 b5. Dropping the king-bishop back to c4 puts white in a different opening altogether, the Italian game, which is characterized by the placement of the light square bishop on c4. It's usually arrived at in 3 moves, after 1 e2 e4, e7 e5, 2 knight g1 f3, knight b8 c6, 3 bishop f1 c4. Here it turns out that the extra move, 3 a7 a6, gotten for free because white wasted a tempo moving the king-bishop twice, 3 bishop f1 b5 and 4 bishop b5 c4, is a handy add-on. If white wants to set up an Italian game, he should go directly into it at move 3, rather than backing into it at move 4 with loss of space and time, which is what black gains by being able to play a7 a6 without having to use a tempo to do it. Correct. The right withdrawal is 4 bishop b5 a4, remaining on the a4 e8 diagonal and staying lined up with black's c6 knight. Just because white doesn't take black's c6 knight on move 4 doesn't mean he never will. Once white supplements the indirect coverage on the e4 pawn by castling kingside, which gets the king out of the center, he will indeed be thinking about the possibility of taking on c6. By removing the black queen knight, bishop a4 takes c6, white might thereafter be able to plunder the e5 pawn with the f3 knight. It's this latent threat to win the black king pawn by exchanging off its protector, the c6 knight, that fuels white's play in the Ruy-Lopez. After 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, knight c6, 3 bishop b5 a6, should white capture the knight or retreat? 4 bishop takes c6 or 4 bishop e2. Correct. The bishop for knight trade, 4 bishop b5 takes c6, brings about pluses and minuses for both sides. Black gets the 2 bishops, which is a potential advantage for the future. If the situation becomes conducive, the bishops can explode with a cross-the-board action. On the other hand, white inflicts permanent damage to black's queenside pawn structure, whether black answers 4 bishop b5 takes c6 by taking back toward the center, 4 b7 takes c6, or away from it, 4 d7 takes c6. It turns out that in the exchange variation of the Ruy-Lopez, bishop b5 takes c6, most players handling black prefer taking away from the center for tactical reasons, in that it opens the d file so that black's queen has access to the central square d4. This is important in the following line. 4 bishop b5 takes c6, d7 takes c6, 5 knight f3 takes e5, queen d8 d4, which forks white's king pawn and king knight, and therefore regains, on the next move, the pawn that white tried to steal. Incorrect. The move that is not well thought of is 4 bishop b5 e2. What is this bishop supposed to be doing on e2 anyway? Take it back a move. Does white play 3 bishop f1 b5 for real, or is it a bluff? You shouldn't play this type of aggressive move without having a planned response to the opponent's natural follow-up, putting the question to the bishop by 3 a7 a6. If white really wants to develop his bishop to e2, he should do it directly on move 3 and avoid giving black the opportunity to add the useful move 3 a7 a6 without loss of tempo. But the truth is, white shouldn't be playing the bishop to e2 on move 3 or move 4, for it's just too passive to support white's natural ambitions. After 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3 d6, 3 d4 knight d7, should white develop or exchange? 4 bishop c4, or 4 d takes e5. Correct. The move with more promise is 4 bishop f1 c4. It develops a new piece, targets f7, and prepares kingside castling. White holds the possible exchange d4 takes e5 in reserve for when it pays dividends. Meanwhile, the situation after 4 bishop f1 c4 is treacherous for black. One careless slip and white is ready to strike at f7. The natural developing move 4 knight g8 f6, for example, is a mistake. White can gain the advantage by taking on e5, 5 d4 takes e5, and it doesn't matter how black takes back. If black takes back with the d-pawn, 5 d6 takes e5, white scores on the square f7 by 6 knight f3 g5. And if black instead takes back on e5 with the queen knight, 5 knight d7 takes e5, white trades knights, 6 knight f3 takes e5, d6 takes e5, and then captures the f7 pawn with check. 7 bishop c4 takes f7 check. This deflection appears to win black's queen. 7 king e8 takes f7, 8 queen d1 takes d8. But black has the rejoinder 8 bishop f8 b4 check, unveiling a discovery to white's queen from the rook at h8. So in order to get anything for the queen, white has to retreat the piece to block the check. 9 queen d8 d2. Black indeed gets the queen back. 9 bishop b4 takes d2 check. But after the queen knight recaptures, 10 knight b1 takes d2, the only material difference is the extra pawn occupying f2, and this belongs to white. Our variation is long-winded, but it shows the kind of pitfalls into which black can fall. Incorrect. The pawn trade 4 d4 takes e5 is more helpful to black than it is to white. White shows his cards too soon. After black retakes on e5, 4 d6 takes e5, the f8 bishop, previously hemmed in by the d6 pawn, is now released from captivity, ready to travel beyond the confines of the e7 square. For instance, after 5 bishop f1 c4, the dark square bishop could start to reside at queen 3, 5 bishop f8 d6, when the invasion of white's f3 knight, 6 knight f3 g5, can be met by developing the king knight, 6 knight g8 h6. It's okay that black's king knight moves to the edge of the board, for now, inasmuch as this adds defense to f7 and prepares castling. In fact, it's all right to violate any general principle if the specific circumstances require it. After 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, knight c6, 3 d4, e takes d4, should white take the pawn or attack black's queen? 4 knight takes d4, or 4 bishop g5? Correct. First, white should take care of business by recapturing the pawn. 4 knight f3 takes d4, which takes priority over the development of the queen bishop. Once white has re-established material equality, then he can turn his attention to mobilizing the rest of his forces. After 4 knight f3 takes d4, white holds the central trump cards, with a knight occupying d4 and a pawn on e4. Meanwhile, none of black's forces sit on any of the 4 middle squares, but black does have a temporary initiative, which he can use to start the attack against white's king pawn. For example, 4 knight g8 f6 develops a piece toward the center and issues a threat to the pawn in question. Incorrect. Bringing out the c1 bishop here, 4 bishop c1 g5, is a delinquent idea. The attack on black's queen is easily met by interposing the king bishop, 4 bishop f8 e7. After the exchange on e7, 5 bishop g5 takes e7, queen d8 takes e7, white's king pawn is suddenly menaced by black's queen. This means there is no time to take back the pawn on d4. 6 knight f3 takes d4, because the king pawn is hanging to black's queen. 6 queen e7 takes e4 check. The outcome of this sortie, 4 bishop c1 g5, is that black winds up gaining time, not white. Moreover, black may very well retain his captured booty on d4, thanks to white's imprudent delay in recapturing. Now it may be too late. Hanging pawns wait for no one. Incorrect. Bringing out the c1 bishop here, 4 bishop c1 g5, is a delinquent idea. After 1 e4 e5, 2 f4 d5, 3 e takes d5, e takes f4, should white advance a pawn or develop a knight? 4 d4 or 4 knight f3? Incorrect. Definitely not 4 d2 d4. No matter how commendable white's intentions, and regardless how thematic the two-square advance of the d-pawn may be, this is the wrong time to move out the queen pawn. Of greater importance is stopping the portentous check of black's queen at h4. If black gets the opportunity to play this queen check, 4 queen d8 h4 check, white must answer it by making a concession. He'll have to move his king to safety, forfeiting the castling privilege. The alternative way of ending the check, blocking on g3, 5 g2 g3, fails to the capture 5 f4 takes g3 when white can't take back on g3 because the h-pawn is pinned to the h1 rook by black's queen. So white will have to move his king, 5 king e1 e2, which disrupts the harmony in the white camp and confers the advantage on black. The moral? Don't allow a queen check at h4 in the king's gambit accepted. 1 e2 e4, e7 e5, 2 f2 f4, e7 takes f4. Avert this possibility by developing the king-knight to f3. Then you can pursue central activity with d2 d4 if and only if the advance fits in. Correct. The knight move 4 knight g1 f3 is called for. This stops the intrusion of black's queen at h4. Moreover, this is the destination square for white's king-knight anyway, the square f3. So why not get it there expeditiously? It's important to realize that once black's king-pawn captures on f4, it guards g3, which dissuades white from blocking on this square with a pawn. So the capture, e5 takes f4, is a signal that should alert white to an impending queen check at h4. The proper response to this signal is to develop the king-knight to f3. After 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3 knight c6, 3 d4 c takes d4, should white recapture or develop a new piece? 4 knight takes d4 or 4 bishop b5. Correct. White should just get his pawn back by 4 knight f3 takes d4. There's nothing fancy about it. It's simply a chore that must be honored. The only reason to deviate from such a course is because something better comes along. And here, nothing has. What white does get after retaking on d4 is a beautifully placed knight to go with his centered king-pawn. He need not fear the possibility of black taking on d4, 4 knight c6 takes d4, for this would bring white's queen to the middle, where it domineers in all directions, and poor black would have no recourse. He wouldn't be able to drive off white's queen, and he couldn't position his own queen comparably. Incorrect. Developing the bishop to queen knight 5 here, 4 bishop f1 b5, looks like a gambit of the d-pawn. But it's more than that. It's a blunder. Nothing defends the bishop, so that when black checks with the queen, 4 queen d8 a5 check, he also attacks the vulnerable light square bishop. After white ends the check, black collects a minor piece. In similar situations, such a queen check can be met by the interposition knight b1 c3, which simultaneously blocks the check and guards the b5 bishop. But black's pawn on d4 usurps c3, preventing white's queen knight from going there safely. Therefore, however white replies to 4 queen d8 a5 check, he must lose a minor piece. If white wants to offer a legitimate gambit, he can play 4 c2 c3. After black takes, 4 d4 takes c3, and white retakes, 5 knight b1 takes c3, white has a big lead in development, with a grip on the center and strong attacking possibilities. But there's no need to risk material sacrifice in order to get an active game. White can stay with the main line, 4 knight f3 takes d4, and do just fine. After 1 e4 e6, 2 d4 d5, 3 knight c3 bishop b4, should white attack the bishop or end the tension? 4 a3 or 4 e5? Incorrect. Attacking the bishop with 4 a2 a3 is a decent move, but lays no claim to being white's best. Essentially, it comes down to an exchange of pawns, white's e-pawn for black's g-pawn. At first, 4 a2 a3 seems to lose a pawn, for black trades bishop for knight. 4 bishop b4 takes c3 check, 5 b2 takes c3, and then seizes the unprotected king-pawn. 5 d5 takes e4. But white has an adequate counter to this in the form of a double attack. 6 queen d1 g4. hitting undefended pawns at e4 and g7. Usually black develops the king-knight, 6, knight g8 f6, which guards e4 and threatens white's queen. White follows by capturing the king-knight pawn. 7, queen g4 takes g7, threatening the cornered rook. The standard response is 7, rook g8, and after 8, queen g7 h6, the position offers about equal chances to both sides. Black's position is a little looser, but he has a protected pawn at e4 and aggressive chances stemming from the open g-file. White has the advantage of the two bishops, but his queenside pawn structure is disordered, and his queen is subject to probing threats, rook g8 g6 for instance, so neither player is ready to give up. Correct. Decreasing the tension with 4 e4 e5 appears to serve white's cause better than any other move. White eliminates once and for all black's threat to gain a pawn by capturing the opposing king pawn. d5 takes e4. By advancing the pawn to e5, white picks up space in the center and on the king side. Equally important is the e5 pawn's influence over the dark squares, which increases in significance once black exchanges off his dark square bishop for white's c3 knight. Bishop b4 takes c3. This could result in the dominance of white's dark square bishop along the a3 f8 diagonal if white can shift the c1 bishop to a3. For example, after 4 e4 e5, black can pressure the center with 4 c7 c5. To compel a decision with the bishop, white might put the question to it, 5 a2 a3, resulting in the exchange of bishop for knight. 5 bishop b4 takes c3 check. 6 b2 takes c3. If black then develops the queen knight, 6 knight b8 c6, white pushes the queen rook pawn again. 7 a3 a4. Why? To clear the square a3 for the c1 bishop, which will soon move to a3 to wreak havoc along the deadly a3 f8 diagonal. From a3 it will make its statement, cutting right into the heart of black's position. With black unable to challenge it now that his own dark square bishop is gone. But black's not out of it either, for there are ways to drum up counteractivity against white's pawn weaknesses, such as moving the queen to a5. After 1 e4 c6, 2 d4 d5, 3 e takes d5, c takes d5, which is the better bishop move? 4 bishop d3 or 4 bishop b5 check? Correct. If you chose 4 bishop f1 d3, you found the better placement. At d3, the bishop is in contact with the center square e4, which is a splendid tip-off that the move has quality. The move of the bishop to d3 also counteracts black's plan to develop the queen bishop to f5, for this square is now guarded by white. But if white on move 4 instead brings out the king knight, 4 knight g1 f3, delaying the development of the light square bishop, black can answer in either of two ways. He can play the c8 bishop to f5, neutralizing the possibility of 5 bishop f1 d3, or he can even move the light square bishop to g4, pinning the f3 knight. This goes to show the importance of timing and move order. Often when analyzing the games of my students, I will ask in certain situations why a particular move hadn't been played. It's not unusual for the student at hand to reply, "But I did play the move, later on. Wait a few moves and you'll see. Look down the score sheet." I have to laugh at this, for the student has failed to grasp that the same move played later is not necessarily the same move. It might not be the same move if the other circumstances on the board are different. The timing of a tactical possibility is often, though not always, the critical thing. The given example is a case in point. By playing bishop f1 d3 on move 4, white controls f5 and therefore stops black from safely playing his bishop to this square. For bishop c8 f5 would then lose a piece to 5 bishop d3 takes f5. But by playing the same development a move later, 5 bishop f1 d3, it's too late, for black has already positioned his bishop on f5. 4 bishop c8 f5 before white can prevent this placement by attacking the f5 square. If white then plays 5 bishop f1 d3, black has the time to defend his bishop, say 5 e7 e6, or to trade it for white's 5 bishop f5 takes d3. If you don't play a move when it works, it might not work when you play it. Incorrect. No strategic purpose is accomplished with 4 bishop f1 b5 check. It's played just for the sake of giving check, which doesn't have intrinsic merit. If anything, it entices black into playing the queen knight to c6, the very square it would go to anyway. Nor does white achieve anything by taking the c6 knight. After 4 bishop f1 b5 check, knight b8 c6, 5 bishop b5 takes c6 check, b7 takes c6, 6 knight g1 f3. Black can deploy his queen bishop on the a6 f1 diagonal, 6 bishop c8 a6, preventing white from castling kingside. This is because the a6 bishop then guards f1, a square in the path of the white king in the act of castling. The rules of chess prevent castling if in doing so the king would pass over a square controlled by an enemy unit. You can't castle through check. Generally, there aren't too many lines where white endeavors to check on b5 with the light square bishop to exchange it early on for a black minor piece. This bishop is usually too valuable in the opening to be surrendered that easily. It's a required piece for certain kinds of attacks, and it's an able defender of the king side, typically guarding vulnerable points and thwarting invasions. After 1 e4 knight f6, 2 e5 knight d5, 3 c4 knight b6, which is the better pawn move? 4 f4 or 4 c5? Incorrect. The wrong pawn move is 4 f2 f4. White envisions a huge central phalanx of pawns at c4, d4, e5, and f4. Under the right conditions, this 4-pawns attack can be imposing. One problem is that white must be careful to avoid overextension, where the pawns are weak and can't be adequately supported. Another problem is that it's not always possible to set up this formation to begin with, and this is the case after black continues 4 c7 c5, essentially holding back the enemy queen pawn. Thereafter, black will follow with moves like knight b8 c6 and d7 d6 to break up the white center. If white isn't cautious, the entire edifice could topple just because white never had the opportunity to place the queen pawn on d4. But change white's fourth move from f2 f4 to d2 d4, and that's a different story. Then white's center does begin to mean something. Correct. The very best move for white is 4 d2 d4, but a reasonable alternative is 4 c4 c5. This pushes the black knight back to the center, 4 knight b6 d5, where it can be attacked again by white's king-bishop, bishop f1 c4, and queen knight, knight b1 c3. Sooner or later the d5 knight will be constrained to take on c3, and with the clearing of lines, white will obtain excellent play for his pieces. What's the downside for white? The shaky pawns at c5 and e5. White could become a little stressed out trying to safeguard them. So a game of mutually balanced chances ensues. But this is all black asks for when he chooses to play Alekhine's defense. 1 e2 e4, knight g8 f6. After 1 e4 d5, 2 e takes d5, queen takes d5, 3 knight c3, queen a5. Which is a better move? 4 knight f3 or d4? Incorrect. The move of the knight, 4 knight g1 f3, while quite good, ends up in second place. And it's not because of 4 knight g8 f6 activating the king knight toward the center when 5 d2 d4 results in a transposition back into the main lines. But developing the queen knight instead, 4 knight b8 c6, is a slightly different story. Now if white follows with a 2-square advance of the queen pawn, 5 d2 d4, black mobilizes the c8 bishop, possibly pinning the f3 knight by 5 bishop c8 g4, and quickly castles on the queen side, perhaps 6 castle queen side. After castling, black's d8 rook pins and threatens the d4 pawn, which in the course of time black can mount additional pressure against. In some situations, for example, black's g4 bishop can remove the f3 knight, or the king pawn can advance to e5, both of which menace d4. It's a matter of timing and circumstances, but white has to be wary of making a wrong step. Correct. Advancing the queen pawn 2 squares, 4 d2 d4, is the better play. It's really the only way white can try to maintain his opening initiative. Black indeed will find life quite difficult if he force-feeds his queen knight into action, 4 knight b8 c6, because white can then strike with 5 d4 d5, attacking the knight and driving it out of position. This pestering push, d4 d5, with its attendant disruption, is only possible because white essayed the earlier advance, 4 d2 d4. Had he instead developed his king knight, 4 knight g1 f3, he'd have to think of something else to keep the position alive and to deal with black's impending plan to castle queenside. After 1 d4 d5, 2 c4 d takes c4, 3 e3 b5, which is the superior undermining advance? 4 a4 or 4 b3? Correct. If white wants to regain his sacrificed pawn, he should play 4 a2 a4, trying to sabotage black's support for c4. Taking white's a pawn, 4 b5 takes a4, fails abysmally to the marauding of white's queen. It starts with the queen taking on a4, giving check, and finishes with the queen taking the pawn on c4. Nor does guarding the b5 pawn by 4 a7 a6 succeed, for white captures the b pawn, 5, a4 takes b5, and black can't take back because the a6 pawn is pinned along the a file to the a8 rook by white's a1 rook. 5, a6 takes b5, 6, rook a1 takes a8. Finally, trying to support the b pawn by 4, c7, c6 also falters, for white exchanges pawns, 5, a4 takes b5, c6 takes b5, and then zooms in on the cornered rook by 6, queen d1, f3. Now here's a case where moving the queen early does make sense, inasmuch as black will have to ditch a minor piece. 6, knight b8, c6, 7, queen f3 takes c6, check. In order to save the rook, 7, bishop c8, d7. In summary, the move 4a2, a4 ensures that white will get back the gambited pawn. Curious thing is, white gains the upper hand by transgressing two ostensible principles. You're not supposed to move the queen early, but here white does, to win a piece. And you're not supposed to move rook pawns in the first few moves either, but here white does, to undermine black's pawn structure. Perhaps we should reconsider these generalities. Maybe each of them has another side. Incorrect. The clever idea behind 4b2, b3 is just a bit too clever for white's own good. The notion is to answer 4, c4 takes b3 by the interjecting 5, bishop f1 takes b5 check. The problem is that black can block the check with a gain of time, 5, c7, c6, threatening to take white's b5 bishop. White must be careful. If he retreats the bishop back to the rook file, 6, bishop b5, a4, black wins a minor piece by checking on a5 with his queen, 6, queen d8, a5 check. Meanwhile, withdrawing the bishop to the c file, 6, bishop b5, c4, enables black to capture again, 6, b3 takes a2, so that he keeps a couple of extra pawns. This brings us to the clever trick. In response to the block, 5, c7, c6, white could simply take back the b pawn, 6, a2 takes b3. The point is that 6, c6 takes b5, apparently winning the bishop, is met by 7, queen d1, f3, once again exploiting the cornered rook. After jettisoning the queen knight, 7, knight b8, c6, 8, queen f3 takes c6, check, black introduces the queen bishop, 8, bishop c8, d7, and his position is quite playable. White is doing okay, but so is black, who at the end of the variation gains time on white's exposed queen. Final assessment: though both moves, 4a2, a4 and 4b2, b3, regain the pawn, white does better with the first choice, the move of the queen-rook pawn. After 1 d4, d5, 2 c4, d takes c4, 3 e4, e5, should white develop a new piece or take the king pawn? 4, knight f3, or d takes e5? Correct. In this instance, development by the king-knight, 4, knight g1, f3, gets the nod. White's intention is to answer 4, e5 takes d4 by taking the queen-bishop pawn, 5, bishop f1 takes c4, which also activates the king-bishop. White thereby hopes to pick up the d pawn a little later. One thing you should know: black shouldn't play 5, c7, c5, trying to hold on to the d4 pawn. For white invades by 6, knight f3, e5, menacing the f7 pawn. If black guards it with 6, bishop c8, e6, white trades bishops. 7, bishop c4 takes e6, f7 takes e6, and then checks with the queen. 8, queen d1, h5, check. Black can block the check with the g-pawn. 8, g7, g6. But this runs into 9, knight e5 takes g6. When taking the knight, 9, h7 takes g6, loses the h8 rook. 10, queen h5 takes h8. So, after 9, knight e5 takes g6, black must counterattack by developing the king-knight. 9, knight g8, f6, which gains time on white's queen and clears the square g8 for the rook. After white withdraws the queen to safety by maintaining the pin, 10, queen h5, h3, and after black shifts his rook out of danger, 10, rook h8, g8, white captures the e-pawn. 11, queen h3 takes e6, check. This leads to the trade of queens, and leaves white a pawn ahead. Not bad for a day's work. Incorrect. The capture 4 d4 takes e5 has been known to be weak for at least 150 years, but not in all that time by the same person. The opening of the d-file permits black to trade queens. 4, queen d8 takes d1, check. 5, king e1 takes d1, depriving white of the ability to castle by forcing the king's movement. Then, in the race to develop pieces, black has the lead. First he gets out the queen-knight, then the queen-bishop, and then he castles queenside, activating the queen-rook and getting the king to safety. A sample variation might go 5, knight b8, c6, attacking the king-pawn, 6, f2, f4, or 6, bishop c1, f4, when black continues 6, bishop c8, e6, 6, bishop c8, g4, check, 7, knight g1, f3, castle queenside, check. It's clear by the end of this analysis that black has seized the initiative, and it's white who must now struggle to equalize. After 1, d4, d5, 2, c4, e6, 3, knight c3, knight f6, should white develop the queen-bishop or prepare to develop the king-bishop? 4, bishop g5, or 4, e3. Correct. Go with the queen-bishop. 4, bishop c1, g5. This was the choice of the American champion Harry Nelson Pillsbury, 1872 to 1906. At the 1895 Hastings tournament, Pillsbury whipped out 4, bishop c1, g5, scored a number of striking wins, and it's been the main line ever since. The idea is to keep black bottled up by putting indirect pressure on the d5 pawn, which results from the pinning attack on black's f6 knight. Here's how it works when black gets too frisky and tries to bust out. If black answers 4, bishop c1, g5 by 4, c7, c5, white starts by exchanging pawns on d5. 5, c4 takes d5, e6 takes d5. From this position, white then trades bishop for knight. 6, bishop g5 takes f6, g7 takes f6. Black must take back with the g-pawn in order to avoid losing his d-pawn. The point is that if black takes with the queen, 6, queen d8 takes f6, white captures the queen pawn. 7, knight c3 takes d5, threatening black's queen and the sensitive c7 square. At the end of the line, black has managed to retain his d-pawn by virtue of 6, g7 takes f6, but at the expense of a busted kingside, which means that castling kingside incurs a certain element of risk for the black king. Incorrect. Not at all bad is 4e2e3. It's just not aggressive enough. Black pretty much equalizes the situation by advancing the queen-bishop-pawn, 4c7c5, when white's first move advantage can only be seen under a microscope. The old-time masters who championed 4e2e3 understood very well that the move hems in the c1 bishop. But the thinking in those days was that the bishop had to remain at c1 to protect white's queenside. The plan was later to develop the c1 bishop at b2 by a fianchetto, subsequently playing b2 b3 and bishop c1 b2. But the entire notion was challenged by the brilliant Pillsbury, who demonstrated the virtues of 4 bishop c1 g5 and thereby impressed the world. The move 4e2e3 has been on the back burner ever since. After 1 d4 d5, 2 c4 c6, 3 knight f3 knight f6, should white advance or develop? 4 c5 or 4 knight c3. Incorrect. Moving the pawn forward, 4 c4 c5, is a step in the wrong direction. The advanced c-pawn then becomes a target for black's b-pawn, 4 b7 b6. The move of the b-pawn threatens to exchange on c5. 5 b6 takes c5, 6 d4 takes c5, and to gain a pawn with a forking queen check, 6 queen d8 a5 check, followed by 7 queen a5 takes c5. White would like to support the beleaguered c-pawn by the advance 5 b2 b4, but it doesn't succeed, for black undermines the effort with 5 a7 a5, and white's whole structure on the queen side collapses. The best that white can do in reply to the counter 4 b7 b6 is to exchange pawns himself. 5 c5 takes b6, a7 takes b6. But this is an admission of failure. The pawn shouldn't have gone to c5 in the first place. Correct. Better than moving the c-pawn is developing a new piece. 4 knight b1 c3. White can decide what to do with his c-pawn later. Perhaps it will go to c5, or perhaps it will capture on d5. Maybe instead it will be black who captures it. 4 d5 takes c4. This latter contingency is not to be feared, for white can answer the capture by 5 a2 a4, preventing black from upholding c4 with the b-pawn, by advancing it to b5. Thereafter, white can regain the c4 pawn by moving the king pawn, 6 e2 e3, which releases the bishop to play 7 bishop f1 takes c4. Overall, white is doing quite well, but black's still in the fight too. After 1 d4 d5, 2 knight f3 knight f6, 3 bishop g5 knight e4, should white defend the bishop or retreat it? 4 h4 or 4 bishop h4. Incorrect. Pushing the rook pawn, 4 h2 h4, is somewhat precarious. The point is to answer the capture 4 knight e4 takes g5 by 5 h4 takes g5, opening the h file for white's king rook. But black doesn't have to play along. He can turn down the exchange of knight for bishop, at least temporarily. Instead, he can switch his attention over to the queen side and the advance 4 c7 c5. This looks to knock out white's d-pawn. The conclusion is that white's rook-pawn move is quite weakening. It saddles white with a permanent liability, while offering nothing independent of black making a mistake that black doesn't have to commit. Correct. The simplest response is to withdraw the piece 4 bishop g5 h4. In this way, white preserves his dark square bishop while maintaining the pin on black's e7 pawn. Also good is withdrawing the bishop to f4, but this abandons the pin on e7. By retreating the bishop to h4, white accomplishes his aims without having to make a debilitating concession, such as an indelible pawn move like 4 h2 h4. In the opening, try to operate mainly with pieces, moving only those pawns that attack or defend the center, whether directly or indirectly. Wing pawns are generally held back to defend entry points on the third rank. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4 e6, 3 knight c3 bishop b4, should white develop a knight or defend one? 4 knight f3 or 4 bishop d2? Correct. The more aggressive move is 4 knight g1 f3, developing a piece to an active square. In this variation of the Nimzo-Indian defense, the c1 bishop is destined to take up an enterprising post at g5, where it pins the f6 knight. White is unconcerned about receiving doubled pawns here. 4 bishop b4 takes c3 check, 5 b2 takes c3, because black must make a concession to inflict them. He must cede the two bishops, which can be a tangible advantage in many situations. But if white can't open the game adequately so that the bishops can flex their muscles, the liability of the doubled c pawns may begin to tell. Incorrect. The safe move, 4 bishop c1 d2, is also the most passive and defensive development that white can choose. The intention is to answer a capture on c3 by taking back with the bishop. Bishop d2 takes c3, avoiding doubled pawns. On the negative side, however, the bishop has reduced scope on this square, so it's difficult for white to maintain the initiative. If white really wants to avoid doubled c pawns, then it should be remedied by the queen, by moving it to c2. On this square, the queen hasn't strayed far from home, so it's not especially exposed to danger. Meanwhile, the queen-bishop still retains the option of moving to an active square such as g5 or f4. Both of these placements are more energetic than moving the bishop to d2, and both preserve white's first move superiority. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4 g6, 3 knight c3 d5, how should white take the d-pawn in this Grunfeld defense? 4 knight takes d5, or 4 c takes d5? Incorrect. Do not take the pawn with the knight. 4 knight c3 takes d5, and not just because it breaks the rule that advises capturing with the least valuable unit when multiple captures are possible. Rather, it has to do with the outcome in the center. After 4 knight c3 takes d5, knight f6 takes d5, 5 c4 takes d5, queen d8 takes d5, black's queen gets to establish itself on a centralized post, without fear of being driven off, at least for the next few moves. Things would be different if white had taken initially with the c-pawn. 4 c4 takes d5. Then, after the recapture, 4 knight f6 takes d5, there would be no need to take on d5 again, and black's queen wouldn't have a centered invitation. White, therefore, would be free to pursue his great central plan, the two-square advance of the king-pawn, 5 e2 e4. Clearly, the thing you take with can be just as significant as the thing taken. Correct. Commence your d5 captures with the pawn, 4 c4 takes d5, signaling the exchange variation of the Grunfeld defense. After black's f6 knight recaptures, 4 knight f6 takes d5, white puts a temporary halt to the exchanges, instead chasing black's knight with a two-square advance of the king-pawn, 5 e2 e4. This gives white an ideal pawn center, with an array of pawns on d4 and e4. If black then takes white's knight, 5 knight d5 takes c3, white takes back, 6 b2 takes c3, solidifying d4. But black is not without opportunities, especially if he can pressure the center into premature advances, so that weaknesses are engendered and the pawns become closer and easier to attack. Still, white's middle pawns are impressive, and the onus is on black to prove their potential fallibility, which is usually the case in the Grunfeld defense. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4 g6, 3 knight c3 bishop g7, which is the better move with the e-pawn, 4 e4 or 4 e3? Correct. The ambitious player will tend to go for 4 e2 e4. It seizes space in the center and menaces aggression with an eventual advance to e5. This will drive off black's f6 knight. Black will no doubt react by advancing the queen pawn one square, 4 d7 d6, which keeps the white e-pawn at bay. But white still has the spatial edge, which gives him more room for maneuvering, greater options, and superior attacking chances. For these reasons, we prefer the two-square movement of white's king-pawn, 4 e2 e4. Incorrect. The conservative player's move is 4 e2 e3. The one-step advance of the king-pawn forgoes any aspirations in the center. Instead, white opts for caution. This needless safety play, positioning a pawn to guard d4, comes at the expense of the c1 bishop, which becomes penned in by the e3 pawn. With the white king-pawn on e4, or yet on e2, this dark square bishop could still come out and be active. But with the pawn at e3, the c1 bishop's scope is greatly reduced, and so are white's chances to build a winning game. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4 c5, 3 d5 e6, should white trade or defend? 4 d takes e6, or 4 knight c3? Incorrect. Trading pawns by 4 d5 takes e6 is weak, though black must exercise judgment on how he takes back. If he recaptures with the queen pawn, 4 d7 takes e6, away from the center, then white trades queens, 5 queen d1 takes d8 check, king e8 takes d8, and black forfeits the right to castle. But if black retakes with the king-bishop pawn, 4 f7 takes e6, capturing toward the center, black obtains much the better of the bargain, especially in two ways. First, he amasses a preponderance of pawns in the middle zone, 3 pawns to white's 2. This should enable black to eventually push his queen pawn to d5, appropriating control of key central squares. The other gain is that black creates an open f-file, which can be used by a rook to attack the white position. To deploy a rook effectively on the f-file, all black has to do is castle kingside. Since black develops this f-file activity quite naturally, as a consequence of taking back on e6 the right way, with the f-pawn, 4 f7 takes e6, it makes sense for white to avoid it by not succumbing to the lure of a trade, by not playing 4 d5 takes e6. Correct. White should back up his d-pawn by 4 knight b1 c3. With the knight on c3, white has the attractive possibility of further support for his queen pawn in the subsequent advance of the king pawn e2 e4. This advance may become necessary if white is to bolster the queen pawn, which really is his only claim to any advantage. It's this advanced d-pawn across the demarcation line on d5 that gives white more operating territory while concomitantly cramping black. Generally, the more advanced your center pawns, the greater your space, and the more room you'll have behind the lines to maneuver. Note, in the situation at hand, white's d5 pawn deprives black's pieces of the use of two vital squares. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4 d6, 3 knight c3 e5, which is the better move with the d-pawn? 4 d takes e5 or 4 d5? Correct. The slightly preferable choice is 4 d4 takes e5, opening the d-file. After black recaptures 4 d6 takes e5, white will trade queens. 5 queen d1 takes d8 check, king e8 takes d8, and black loses the castling privilege. Actually, losing the ability to castle here is not that big a deal, as it is in other openings and situations. The black king can easily find shelter at c7 by first advancing the c-pawn to c6. Also, even with black's king confined to the center, it's hard for white to manufacture real threats against it. His f1 bishop, for example, cannot even get to c4, for this square is blocked by a white pawn. Still, whatever advantage there is in the position probably belongs to white. Incorrect. Locking the pawn structure with 4 d4 d5 is okay, but it doesn't offer white much in the way of opportunity. Black will follow with 4 bishop c8 f5, making it difficult for white to get a pawn up to e4. True, black has less maneuvering space on the queen side, but he makes up for it in the center and on the king side, where he's at least equal. For the record, the main move here is 4 knight g1 f3, which leaves the fate of white's d-pawn pending for a bit. This is more flexible and offers white more options. White can advance d4 d5, trade d4 takes e5, or continue to maintain the status quo. It gives black something to think about, for he can't be sure just what white intends to do. No one is immune from doubt. After 1 c4 e5, 2 knight c3 knight f6, 3 knight f3 knight c6, where should white move the d-pawn? 4d4 or 4d3. Correct. To try for an advantage, white should play 4d2d4, a two-square shot with the queen pawn. It's a more forcing move than its one-square alternative, 4d2d3, and black must play sharply himself to stay level. Black's most promising continuation is to exchange pawns. 4 e5 takes d4, 5 knight f3 takes d4, and to follow with a pin on white's queen knight, 5 bishop f8 b4. In order to press his initiative, white will have to accept doubled c pawns, allowing black's b4 bishop to take the c3 knight, when only the b2 pawn can take back. White thereby acquires structural impediments, such as doubled c pawns and an isolated a pawn. But white's attack should count for more than these. Incorrect. The quiet response is 4d2d3, a one-square advance of the queen pawn. In its own way, it's just as good as the two-square advance, 4d2d4, but it has a drawback. It doesn't place any real pressure on black's center. Rather, it presents the opponent with plenty of options because nothing is threatened, so black can pursue his own plans unimpeded. The purpose of d2d3 is twofold. At d3, the queen pawn joins the fight against the central light squares, in particular by guarding e4. Secondly, the move lets out the queen bishop by unblocking the c1 h6 diagonal. This helps in the fight to counter black's potential pin on the c3 knight. If black were to play 4 bishop f8 b4, white could reply with 5 bishop c1 d2, overprotecting c3 and avoiding doubled pawns, not that doubled pawns signal the end of the world. As a final piece of advice, it's better for improving players to take the more active course with 4d2d4. You'll learn a lot faster when you try to make things happen if you play aggressively even when the moves you select falter. In failing, either you'll learn how to make them work, or you'll realize the time has come to let them go. After 1 c4 c5, 2 knight c3 knight f6, 3 g3 d5, should white take with the knight or the pawn? 4 knight takes d5, or 4 c takes d5? Incorrect. On the surface, taking with the knight, 4 knight c3 takes d5 looks like an error, and it actually is. Generally, you're supposed to start a series of captures, 2 or more, by taking with the unit of lowest value. This suggests taking here with the pawn, 4 c4 takes d5, not the knight. Specifically, the effect of taking with the knight, 4 knight c3 takes d5, is to bring black's queen powerfully to the center. 4 knight f6 takes d5, 5 c4 takes d5, queen d8 takes d5. Both sides participate in the captures, but only black's last move develops a piece, the queen to d5, which menaces the rook at h1. This gains time in that white must spend a move responding to the threat, and this is the chief way to gain time in the opening, by developing new pieces with threats. Correct. Take back with the pawn, 4 c4 takes d5. This provides white with more options. After black retakes, 4 knight f6 takes d5, white doesn't have to continue the exchanges, drawing black's queen to the center, for black's d5 knight doesn't threaten anything, inasmuch as white's c3 knight is dependably guarded by 2 pawns. Instead of taking on d5 a second time, white should use the move to complete the fianchetto of the king-bishop, 5 bishop f1 g2, trying to gain time by attacking black's d5 knight. Will black's d5 knight capture white's c3 knight? 5 knight d5 takes c3. This exchange strengthens white's center after he takes back with the queen-knight pawn. 6 b2 takes c3. Will black invest a move to defend the d5 knight with the king pawn? 5 e7 e6. This advance obstructs the c8 h3 diagonal. Or finally, will black retreat the threatened knight to safety? 5 knight d5 c7. This withdrawal forfeits a tempo while opening the g2 b7 diagonal for white's flanked bishop. Black is surviving in all these cases, but it's white who has control of his chessic life. After 1 knight f3 knight f6, 2 g3 g6, 3 bishop g2 bishop g7, should white castle or develop a new piece? 4 castle kingside, or knight c3. Correct. Castling, 4 castle kingside, is the fundamentally sounder move. It's also what white intends to do anyway. Playing it now, therefore, reveals practically nothing. For in this line, black expects white to castle kingside sooner or later. But developing the queen-knight to c3 is more committal, for in this type of position, c3 is not the only useful deployment for the queen-knight. Sometimes it provides fruitful service at d2, after white first has played d2, d3. It depends how the game evolves. By not yet activating the queen-knight on move 4, white retains more options, and thereby binds his opponent, who must stay ready for either contingency, knight b1 c3 or knight b1 d2. Finally, there's a related problem with 4 knight b1 c3, in that it needlessly blocks the c-pawn. White may need the ability to move this pawn if he is to get active play in the center. For these reasons, it makes greater sense on move 4 to delay the queen-knight's development in favor of castling kingside. Incorrect. The immediate 4 knight b1 c3 may appear to be a fine developing move, but it walls in the c-pawn. In flank openings, as in queen-pawn openings, it's generally undesirable to block the c-pawn, especially early in the game. If white wants to develop the queen-knight to c3, it's best to move out the c-pawn first, 4 c2 c4. Once the c-pawn has staked out its territory, then white can develop the queen-knight behind it to c3 with no loss of harmony. But after the antithetical 4 knight b1 c3, black has the riposte 4 d7 d5, with the option of advancing the d-pawn even further, d5 d4, if it's deemed desirable. If white's c-pawn were already on c4, however, it could now be exchanged for black's d-pawn. This action would destroy the potential invader, the black d-pawn, and it would also give white a central pawn majority of 2 pawns to 1, white's d and e pawns versus black's e pawn. But alas, such is not the case. White's c-pawn is not on c4, and it's not about to get there soon. So black finds himself in the enviable situation of being able to fight for the center with 3 pawns, the c-pawn, the d-pawn, and the e-pawn. Contrast this with white, who is handicapped in that he can use only 2 central foot soldiers, the d-pawn and the e-pawn. His c-pawn is rendered at least temporarily useless in consequence of the awkward c3 knight's obstruction. Obviously, not all developing moves are good. Some are even quite bad. After 1 knight f3 d5, 2 c4 d4, 3 e3 d takes e3, which is a better way to take back? 4 d takes e3 or 4 f takes e3? Incorrect. Certainly not with the d-pawn, 4 d2 takes e3. This take-back opens the d-file, permitting black to exchange queens to white's detriment. 4 queen d8 takes d1 check, 5 king e1 takes d1. The result is that white loses the right to castle. This reduction in capability should be significant here, for black can muster considerable pressure against the exposed king by positioning a rook at d8, possibly by castling queenside. There's another problem in the cumbersome situation of white's king. It gets in the way of the rooks, so that they can't directly support each other or freely move along the home rank. When the rooks acquire this ability to function unhindered along their original rank, we say they are connected, and connecting the rooks is one of the primary opening objectives. Obviously, white here is going to have some difficulty achieving this aim with his own king blocking the way. Instead of taking back the right way, 4 f2 takes e3 toward the center, white recaptures the wrong way, 4 d2 takes e3 away from the center, which violates the principle concerning direction of capture. It also leads to an inferior position with complex problems to solve. We wish him well. Correct. If white wants to emphasize the error of black's approach, he should take back toward the center. 4 f2 takes e3. By taking white's king pawn, 3 d4 takes e3, black has surrendered his hold over d4. White will expropriate the d4 square for himself by the subsequent push d2 d4. Black can do little to stop the oncoming advance, for white's queen pawn already has the backing of 3 supporters: the e3 pawn, the f3 knight, and the queen. Many players would be fearful of making a capture such as 4 f2 takes e3, thinking that by moving the f-pawn early they would be endangering the safety of their own king. Of course, they're right to be sensitive to the king's predicament, but they shouldn't pass up a golden opportunity for attack without concretely analyzing the situation. Here, with the king-knight in place at f3, there's no immediate way for black to exploit the weakened e1 h4 diagonal, the typical line of vulnerability entailed by an early f-pawn move. White's king-knight is a sound insurance policy against a black-queen check at h4. We're not suggesting that you become a chess gambler and assume needless risks. But if you want to be a consistent winner, you should regularly experience what it's like to take calculated chances, not by guesswork, but by reasoned analysis. After 1 b4 e5, 2 bishop b2, bishop takes b4, 3 bishop takes e5, knight f6, which is a better move? 4 c3 or 4 knight f3? Incorrect. The advance of the queen-bishop pawn, 4 c2 c3, commences a bad plan. The move denies white the optimal square for his queen-knight, c3. It also cuts off the retreat of the e5 bishop on the a1 h8 diagonal. White plays this push to chase black's dark square bishop, but the scheme flops if pursued rigidly. For example, let's say black retreats the bishop, 4 bishop b4 a5. White continues with 5 knight b1 a3, which for now is the only way the queen-knight can come out. Black answers 5 d7 d6, hitting white's e5 bishop, and in order to gain time to fuel his assault, white trades bishop for knight, 6 bishop e5 takes f6. After black takes back, 6 queen d8 takes f6, white forks king and bishop by 7 queen d1 a4 check, though black can save both with the interposition 7 knight b8 c6. This is where white's queen knight can suddenly transfer back to the center by 8 knight a3 c4. Sometimes it's perfectly plausible to develop a knight to the edge, knowing that you can soon maneuver it toward the middle. If black responds by withdrawing the bishop to the third rank, 8 bishop a5 b6, white inflicts serious pawn weaknesses with 9 knight c4 takes b6, when black is forced to take back with his c-pawn, 9 c7 takes b6. The pin on the a-pawn makes it unthinkable for black to take back toward the center, 9 a7 takes b6. For this loses the a8 rook to white's queen. 10 queen a4 takes a8. Therein lies the rub, for black doesn't have to retreat the bishop to b6 when white's knight assails it from c4. 8 knight a3 c4. Instead, he can pull the trigger on the sacrificial bolt. 8 bishop a5 takes c3, which wins a pawn, for white can't safely take the bishop. If he does remove the offered piece, 9 d2 takes c3, black's queen gains the cornered white rook by taking on c3 with check, 9 queen takes c3 check, and on the next move, swallowing the cornered rook, 10 queen c3 takes a1. But white can assuage his embarrassment by admitting his error and changing plans. After 4 c2 c3 bishop b4 a5, he can get back on track with the surprising 5 c3 c4. He's wasted a tempo because the c-pawn moves twice in reaching c4, yet he's corrected the problems created by his previous play. He's cleared c3 and given the e5 bishop a diagonal of retreat. Sometimes, to save yourself, you have to admit your mistake and start all over again. Correct. The sensible move is 4 knight g1 f3. It's reasonable to assume that black will soon castle and then place a rook on the open e-file, open for black because his king-pawn is gone. This will create some potential danger for white's king if it stays in the center a while longer. But 4 knight g1 f3 begins to cope with this possibility, for by developing the king-knight, white is a tempo closer to castling kingside. If everything goes white's way, he will follow with a one-square advance of the king-pawn, 5 e2 e3. He will continue with a quiet, sheltering development of the king-bishop, 6 bishop f1 e2, and he will complete the move trio by the deliberate act of castling, 7 kingside castle. If in the process his e5 bishop comes under attack, he can retreat it to relative safety at b2. This is a trustworthy way to go if white wants to avert early mishaps so that he can attain a playable middle game.